I'm Philip Munoz. I'm the director of the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government. We're co-sponsoring this panel, or sponsoring this panel at the Fall Conference. Special thanks to everyone at the DCEC for hosting this and bringing this great tradition back to Notre Dame for its 25th year. My task is simply to introduce our speakers and hopefully to provoke a fight between them. Speaking first will be Melissa Moschella. Melissa is a professor of the practice and philosophy here at the University of Notre Dame at Notre Dame's McGrath Institute for Church Life. Her work spans the fields of ethics, political philosophy, and law. She's published 2 books, and unfortunately I forgot to bring the book that's going to be the focus.
Come on,
Bill has the book. Ethics, Politics, and Natural Law, Principles for Human Flourishing. It is certainly the efficient cause, maybe the final cause of our panel this morning. Speaking second is Bill Madison. Bill is the Wisely College Professor of Theology here at the University of Notre Dame. He also received his PhD here. He's published 4 books, including the ironically titled Growing in Virtue.
That's what happens when your buddy introduces you.
In 2023, he was appointed to be the faculty director of our Moreau first-year program. That is the one requirement that all students at Notre Dame have to take. So he is quite literally designing the curriculum for every Notre Dame student, and is doing a phenomenal job at it. In 2025, somewhat inexplicably, he began to routinely beat me in our weekly pickleball games, something that goes against both the old and new natural law. V. Bradley Lewis is Dean and Associate Professor of Philosophy at the School of Philosophy at Catholic University of America, a PhD from Notre Dame in Government and International Relations, a title we deeply miss. When he's not deaning, he specializes in political and legal philosophy. He's currently working on a book project, perhaps the subject of next year's Fall Conference panel, provisionally titled The Common Good and the Modern State. The clever and very amusingly proposed title for this panel was Old Natural Law, New Natural Law, Whose Natural Law? That title was rejected. But nonetheless, we're going to use it this morning. Let me welcome Professor Moschella to lead us off.
Well, first of all, thanks very much to the CCCG and the DCEC for co-sponsoring this panel, and special thanks to Phil and Brad and Bill, friends and esteemed colleagues who I know are very busy, so I'm deeply honored that you've taken the time to be on this panel and to engage with my work. So I want to get the conversation started by highlighting a few areas of dispute among contemporary natural law theorists working within the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, and pointing out how my recent book, Ethics, Politics, and Natural Law, contributes to these debates, in part by trying to build bridges between the so-called new natural law theory and its old natural law critics. 3 areas of dispute that I want to focus on are, first, the relationship between natural law and human nature. I'll spend the most time on that. Then the place of virtue in natural law theory, and finally the scope and limits of political authority and the political common good. So first, on the relationship between natural law and human nature, there's a debate about whether we can derive moral principles directly from theoretical facts about human nature, such as facts about human biology. New Natural Law, or NNL, says that while theoretical facts about human nature are certainly relevant to moral reasoning, we can't directly derive normative conclusions from merely descriptive or theoretical premises. This is not, as some critics claim, because NNL denies the existence of natural teleology, but rather because NNL recognizes that we have a complex nature, and our teleology as organisms, for instance, doesn't always line up with our teleology as moral agents. Natural law is a moral law, directing us to our fulfillment as moral agents, and our fulfillment as moral agents may sometimes conflict with our fulfillment as animal organisms, as when, for instance, your moral duty requires you to fast or to risk your life for your country. The book develops this point in detail by explaining an important methodological presupposition of NNL. This is drawn from Aquinas' commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics, where he outlines the 4 orders. And those of you who had a handout, sorry, I was not that optimistic about how many people would come to this, so I did not make enough handouts. But for those of you who have a handout, there's a table that has the passage and kind of summarizes these points. In this passage from the commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics, Aquinas outlines the 4 orders, that is, 4 ways that reason relates to order, and he uses this to differentiate various fields of knowledge. So there's the first order, which I'll refer to as the physical order. This is the order that reason can know, but in no way establishes. The second order is the logical order, which reason establishes in its own acts of consideration. These first 2 orders are theoretical. The third order, which the field of moral philosophy or ethics reflects on, is the order that reason in deliberating establishes in the operations of the will. And finally, the fourth order is the technical order, which reason establishes in things external to the intellect and will. These last 2 orders are practical. Now, each of these orders corresponds to one dimension of our complex nature, for we are animals, thinkers, moral agents, and makers. But the existence of all the orders, and thus of all these dimensions of our nature, is also a metaphysical truth. And all of these orders are united within a single unified human nature, and these points are summarized on the handout. Now, the principles of natural law are third-order principles that direct us toward the perfection of our nature as moral agents. For instance, the first principles of practical reason, which are the first principles of the moral order, direct us toward basic goods, such as life and knowledge and friendship. Each of these perfect an aspect of our nature. Our flourishing as moral agents requires that, in our choices and actions, our will needs to remain open and adequately responsive to the goodness of all basic goods for all people. It requires, in other words, that we act in accord with the guidance offered by all of the first principles of practical reason directing us toward basic goods, considered as a whole. Now, by recognizing that ethics is a third-order discipline which has its own principles that are related to, but not deduced from, theoretical first-order knowledge of human nature, such as descriptions of our ends as organisms or of our instinctive tendencies, NNL avoids the Humean or utilitarian reduction of ethics to a combination of, on the one hand, sub-rational desires that give us our ends, first order, and technical or fourth order reasoning about the most effective means to achieve those ends. Now, it's precisely to avoid this typical modern reductionism and preserve the irreducibility of the moral order, including our capacity for free choice, that NNL places so much emphasis on the moral order as having its own underived first principles. So despite what critics often say, NNL is actually following Aquinas against Hume here, not following Hume. Through my explanation of the role that the 4 orders play in NNL's methodology and its account of human nature, I attempt to respond to critics who mistakenly claim that, for instance, NNL is Humean or Kantian, or that it lacks a teleological account of human nature or tries to construct an ethics independent of human nature. Now, a second point of dispute between NNL and other approaches to Thomistic natural law regards the role of virtues. Critics often claim that NNL gives short shrift to virtues. But NNL has said a fair amount about virtues and has contributed to virtue ethics by clarifying the relationship between moral principles and virtues, showing how virtues fit within a coherent overall natural law theory. Although it's true that NNL does focus more on moral principles than on virtues, this isn't because virtues are ignored or considered unimportant, but rather because without moral principles, we can't know what counts as a virtue in the first place. Overcoming fear or risking imprisonment to rob a bank is not an example of genuine courage, because courage is a disposition to overcome difficulties and dangers to pursue what is genuinely good in a morally upright way. So we can't know what counts as true courage unless we already know what is morally right. That is, unless we know what practical reasonableness requires. At least at the level of theory, therefore, moral principles are prior to virtues. However, this claim is fully compatible with a recognition that at the level of practice, in real life, Moral virtues, or at least proto-virtuous dispositions, are required for sound practical reasoning. So in practice, there's an inextricable connection between virtuous dispositions and knowledge of moral principles and how to apply them. My discussion of virtues in chapter 2 of the book highlights and offers a systematic presentation of NNL's account of the role of virtues in the moral life and of the connection between virtues and moral principles. This connection is clearest when one recognizes that the primary obstacle to morally sound deliberation and morally upright choices are inclinations or desires unintegrated with reason. Following a little-known appendix to Volume 3 of Germaine Griset's The Way of the Lord Jesus, I offer a systematic account of three main ways in which unintegrated inclinations can fetter, obscure, or distort our practical deliberations. And I discuss the corresponding virtues that integrate these inclinations with reason and thus enable us to reliably make and act upon sound moral judgments, in part by training our emotions to be more in line with what reason requires. Last, there are debates among Thomistic natural law theorists about the nature of the political common good. In particular, is the political common good limited and mostly instrumental, or does the political common good directly encompass the whole of human flourishing and instantiate a distinct basic good? I address this issue in chapter 4 of the book, emphasizing the limited and subsidiary nature of political community. Political authority is limited by its purpose, which is to remedy the lack of self-sufficiency of the sub-political communities that compose it, resolving coordination problems for the common good. This is the book's longest and most complex chapter, but what I want to highlight here is the strategy for both affirming the Aristotelian view of politics as fundamentally about respecting and promoting all-around human flourishing, while at the same time arguing that the role of government, that is, of the coercive exercise of political authority, in promoting human flourishing is limited and largely indirect. And this is due precisely to the nature and requirements of human flourishing, not to any kind of pretense to liberal neutrality. In other words, the book offers a perfectionist Aristotelian defense of limited government and of a mostly instrumental account of the specifically political common good, that aspect of the common good for which government is responsible, while also affirming the existence of non-instrumental, all-inclusive common good. Responsibility for that all-inclusive common good, however, is distributed among various individuals and groups in accordance with their proper spheres of competence. So the chapter is an attempt to kind of square the circle by preserving the best of both Aristotelian and liberal accounts of politics while avoiding their pitfalls. In other words, the book draws on perfectionist Aristotelian premises to defend civil liberties and institutions of limited government that are commonly associated with liberalism, but that I believe can be more firmly grounded in natural law principles. So I'm going to leave it there so that we can have more time for broader discussion later.
Well, thanks to my friend and colleague and non-victorious pickleball partner, Philip Munoz, and his center for sponsoring this session, and of course to Ginny Martin and all the great folks at the Nicola who do such a great job with this every year, right? It's thanks be to God for this conference. So for this session today on natural law, and in McIntyrean Echo, I kind of needed you to keep that title in there, which was, what is it, Who's Natural Law? Who's Natural Law, Which Natural Law, or something? It's a reference to McIntyre in the title of this that Philip skipped. So it's also great to be with my colleague of 10 years, Brad Lewis, now Dean Lewis from Catholic U, and especially a treat to be with Melissa, also a former colleague at Catholic U, now a colleague at Notre Dame, and most importantly, she's married to one of my closest friends for 25 years, who's here somewhere. So Melissa's been a great conversation partner on all things related to the new natural law, given her recent book, Ethics, Politics, and Natural Law. Now, the book is an achievement in its own right as a lucid, foundational account of morality in the vein of the new natural law. But as she notes in her opening remarks, it's especially important in attempting to build bridges, bridging divides between traditional Thomistic natural law and new natural law scholars. The book begins with a charming autobiographical account of how she was seeking more from her moral philosophical formation in her Harvard undergraduate education, And she found that later on in the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, and was actually very wary of new natural law when she was initially exposed to it. But in no small part, due to the robust community of scholarship among new natural lawyers, she came to see its intellectual claims as actually more persuasive. And that journey, I think, helps explain the important role she's been playing in the academy these days, which is as a proponent of new natural law theory who's eager to converse with and build bridges with Thomists who are not committed to the new natural law approach. So I share that interest of Melissa's in that dialogue, if for nothing else, that it helps scholars to sharpen their own various arguments and commitments. I also view new natural law theorists, of whom I am not one, as siblings in the same family sharing crucial commitments. And indeed, in reading her book, I found myself cataloging the extensive common commitments that new natural law folks share with traditional Thomists. Of course, that's a family of tradition, too. But now, there's no big but coming here, in case you're expecting that. Sorry, I don't think there's going to be any fireworks. But Melissa obviously very lucidly laid out 3 points in her remarks, which she generously shared ahead of time. I'm going to focus on the first two and leave to Brad the third. So I'm going to focus on her comments on Aquinas' quote at the start of the commentary on Nicomachean Ethics. That's the chart that you have in front of you there. As well as her words on virtue and how there's a robust place for virtue in a new natural law approach. In fact, given my own focus and my scholarship on virtue, I'm going to do the second one first, and then we'll arrive at the former. All right, so a main thrust of Melissa's argument in her book is that the new natural law approach takes up the best aspects of the big three approaches to moral philosophy: consequentialism, deontology, and virtue ethics, while remedying their weaknesses. So how does it do this with regard to virtue ethics? Well, the claim is that the new natural law approach has a robust place for virtues and remedies the common neglect of what she calls moral principles, or what are traditionally called moral laws, in virtue ethics. And in this, she's absolutely correct that virtue approaches to morality too often give short shrift to moral norms and indeed to the natural law more broadly. Indeed, MacIntyre increasingly recognized the importance of moral norms in his work. And in the new natural law approach, as Melissa mentioned, moral principles are prior to virtues because they specify what constitutes the acts of, say, courage. It is indeed the case that virtues rely on prior principles, including what new natural law folks call basic goods, and traditional Thomists describe as natural inclinations. As Thomas would say, virtues, qua habits, stably specify the more inchoate ends of a person's natural powers to be inclined toward further actualization in concrete actions. So virtues, according to Thomas, are akin to funnels. They channel the teleology of our natural capacities towards stable and more specific actualization. Virtues do not necessitate nor fully determine actions, and so, as Melissa referenced, as more specified inclinations, they supply what must be concretely instantiated in particular acts through practical reasoning, and that process is indeed guided by laws. So Melissa's account of virtue in new natural law recognizes the importance of moral principles, as she says. She adopts Griset's modes of responsibility to show how various traditional virtues, like temperance and justice and courage, are relevant to various spheres of activity. Now, a traditional Thomist would agree with these claims, but say more. So how so? So posing the question, what does possessing the virtues get you, might help us answer this. Now, Melissa has an answer to this through a creative development of an appendix to Griset's Way to the Lord Jesus, Volume 3, where she describes the various ways that unintegrated inclinations can impede practical reasoning. In her book, she describes these emotional motivations as, quote, first-order animal aspects of human nature. So more on that first-order reference in a moment. So in what sense are these akin to what traditional Thomists would call contrary dispositions, often at the sensory rather than rational level of the person? What do the virtues offer in such a situation? Well, Melissa describes Griset's imaginative exercises that expand our feelings, such that those feelings no longer impede practical reasoning. Yet on this account, it is not clear how, or really if, those animal nature emotional motivations are actually ever transformed. Thomas's favorite expression for this process is that they participate in reason, a phrase I couldn't find in the account of New Natural Law. Indeed, along with this neglect of how human non-rational nature can participate in reason, we have a focus on practical reasoning that evokes a reduction of all virtue to practical reasoning, akin to Stoic thought, or possibly more problematically, a Kantian label of virtue that is really just a stable readiness to do what is one's moral duty, or to follow practical reasoning, rather than a supplying of more particular ends to guide that reasoning, and in doing so, show how the various facets of human nature participate in reason. On Griset's account of the modes of responsibility, virtues function primarily as a grouping mechanism for arenas of activity where acting reasonably shares certain important similarities, at one point labeled intermediate moral norms. Now, the Thomistic account does say that, but much more. Whereas on the New Natural Law account, those emotional motivations cannot point to, quote, intelligible goods. On the Thomistic account, our sensitive appetite, shared in common with animals, can indeed participate in reason, such that the sensory endedness of the human animal can participate in rationality. So now perhaps my concern about Melissa's interpretation of the four ways reason orders is becoming a little more clear. It has to do with that column on the far right. So recall that the moral realm, the realm of natural law, is the third order principles where the person is described as a moral agent. Absolutely true. Part of reason's task in ordering is deliberation. In fact, in the quote that Melissa bases that chart on, Thomas explicitly refers to deliberation in the third order. And deliberation is oriented toward choice as the culmination of a complex practical reasoning process whereby a person's will, which issues an action and makes the person good or not, is informed by practical reasoning. However, that is the same reason, although under a different formality, as first order reason. Now, many here will recognize the relevance of an ongoing dispute about the relationship between speculative and practical reasoning in disputes between new natural lawyers and traditional Thomists, and indeed, Melissa referenced those disputes. But I want to accentuate a different direction here. Related to the prior point on virtue, I'm concerned about an excessive division between the first and third order on Melissa's chart, and in particular, the way that the human person as moral agent in the third order is separated off from the human person as animal organism in the first order. The interpretation of the four orders offered here, and I want to say that much of it seems absolutely right to me, except that far right column, corresponds to another distinction made in Melissa's book between the law of nature as distinct from the natural law, with the former law of nature corresponding to the first level order, her example is the digestive powers of the person, and the latter corresponding to the third order, which is her example is moral agency. Notice, by the way, we don't have the non-rational powers that can participate in reason. So what's the danger here in too sharply dividing the pre-rational from the rational, the animal from the distinctively human? Well, for an alternate starting point, consider the way that MacIntyre's Dependent Rational Animals describes the continuities between non-rational animals and humans as dependent rational animals. Non-human animals have goods and ends, which he says engender reasons for action, though not in the same way that humans have reasons for actions, more like intelligible, goal-oriented activity. He notes how Aquinas and Aristotle both speak capaciously at times of animal practical reasoning. Now, to be clear, as MacIntyre is, non-rational animals do not practically reason as humans do. But the key point here is that by beginning inductively with the ends that we share with animals, human practical reasoning is not understood over and against or supervening upon natural inclinations, as a more Kantian account would offer, or even as rational agency, quote, from a third order perspective as opposed to our nature understood as a first order reality. This latter approach rightly emphasizes the distinctiveness of human rational agency, yet at the cost of severing it from our status as animal organisms, thus threatening not only our continuity with non-rational animals, but also the possibility of our non-rational capacities' participation in reason. So in the new natural law approach, first order animality cannot be envisioned as including engaged activity towards some goods, those are quotes, and thus it is sealed off from the moral realm. So hence, while in the broader spectrum of moral philosophy, I regard new natural law as a close relative with many insights to offer on certain matters, and today I focus on what the account of the virtues supply and the continuity between rational and non-rational animals. I think the account needs some revision, or perhaps these issues manifest problems with more fundamental commitments in new natural law. Thank you.
I want to thank Philip also for the invitation. I greedily accept all invitations to engage in intellectual activity, lest any remaining capacity that I have for such things atrophy as I spend all my time going to meetings and writing emails. And also to thank my old colleagues Melissa and Bill. And I want to begin just by congratulating Melissa Moschella on this book, which is an admirably clear and concise presentation of the theory of natural law associated with the so-called New Natural Law School. It will, I hope, dispel some common misunderstandings and misrepresentations of the views of this school, and thereby make possible a far more fruitful discussion and debate among the proponents of other branches of the natural law family, as well as its cousins and more distant relations. In furtherance of such conversations, I want to make some brief remarks about just two aspects of Melissa's presentation of the, as it were, political philosophy of the new natural law, more specifically about its understanding of the common good. I do not regard these remarks as evincing anything as strong as disagreement as such. Rather, they're intended to press some questions that I think deserve further and more extensive consideration. They stem from the same Thomistic Aristotelian tradition of inquiry, and so they're friendly questions. One question concerns the way the common good is understood, and concomitantly the, as it were, status of the political on the new natural law view. The other concerns some historical conditions and contexts of any Thomistic Aristotelian understanding of political things in our time, and in particular some aspects of Catholic social doctrine about the common good. So Melissa, following especially John Finnis, distinguishes between a comprehensive or integral common good, the flourishing of all persons, and the specifically political common good. And that distinction between those two things is actually even older than John Finnis's view. You can find a version of that made by Oswald von Nell-Breuning, the kind of ghostwriter of Quadragesimo Anno all the way back in the 1930s, but in the commentary that he wrote on Gaudium et Spes after the council, you've already got a kind of two-level view of the common good that was spelled out by him in the late 60s, early 70s. The specifically political common good is largely instrumental on this view to the good of individuals, but more importantly, families and intermediate associations. It's not completely instrumental, since it includes elements of restorative justice and civic friendship, the latter of which is a basic form of good on the new natural law view and therefore choice-worthy for its own sake. These are two important elements of this characterization of the specifically political common good. There are two important elements. First, it's not a basic form of good. The political common good is not a basic form of good, but a largely instrumental good consisting of coordinating the activities of persons and groups, and this mostly through coercive authority. Second, the family and intermediate associations are the primary sites of human flourishing, not the political community. Some more traditional Thomists have worried that this understanding of the common good fails to do justice to the dignity of political life, and also to the classical conception of the common good as a real final cause. Moreover, they suggest that the Thomistic Aristotelian tradition holds that there is a particular virtue, the virtue of legal justice, grounded in a natural inclination to political life, suggesting that it is a distinct and intrinsic good. To see the political common good as instrumental relative to the goods of lower level societies, so family, intermediate associations, etc., and individuals, presents the disconcerting and, on this view, perhaps unnatural spectacle of the higher put to the service of the lower. Partisans of a more classical view have sometimes cited a passage early in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, a passage cited not infrequently by both Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas, that, quote, "While the good of an individual is a desirable thing, the good of a nation or a city is nobler and more divine." And that language of the divinity of political authority is something that you find in the sort of early works of the Catholic social teaching tradition. This is the way Leo XIII often talked about political things. While the language of nobility and divinity suggests something very exalted indeed, and there are people who've made quite heavy weather of especially those words that Aristotle uses, I am inclined to agree with Yves Simon that those terms indicate the range of goods and perfections contained in a larger social body, so its goodness is a reflection of all the goods that are contained within the political community and made possible by it, and its relatively immortal character. Well, of course, no political community is genuinely immoral, but compared with the life of a single human being or generation, it looks that way, and for practical purposes, you sort of think of it that way. You don't make decisions thinking the United States is going to collapse someday. Maybe very quickly, but even though that's bound to happen at some point, unless the eschaton occurs more rapidly than we presently expect. But you don't think that way in terms of political deliberation. Still, Yves Simon did not, in holding this particular interpretation of those two words, did not underrate the very great good of political life. This is a quote from the General Theory of Authority. Human communities are the highest attainments of nature, for they are virtually unlimited with regard to the diversity of perfections and virtually immortal. Beyond the satisfaction of individual needs and association of men, the association of men serves a good unique in plenitude and duration, the common good of the human community. The good brought into being and made available to human persons through political life, and most likely impossible without political life, is considerable. The political community is the great achievement of civilization, and its qualities have an outsized influence on one's life chances. As the Roman historian Valerius Maximus wrote, "It's better to be poor in a rich empire than rich in a poor empire." The phrase was quoted more than once by Thomas Aquinas. We can go a bit further. The new natural law view is resolute in denying that the political common good instantiates a basic form of good. One might ask then, for the sake of argument, what kind of good might be instantiated in the political common good? I mean, if we did say it instantiated a particular kind of good, what would it be? So consider another passage from Aristotle, this time from Politics 1:2. There, Aristotle describes the natural development of the polis out of the smaller communities of man and woman, of the household and the village. The polis, he says, is the best community and the end of the others. Why? Because it and only it makes possible not just living, but living well. Because of the material self-sufficiency achieved by a division of labor, but also because in the city, in its explicitly political aspect, and only once it has achieved that aspect, does the human capacity for rational speech emerge. Rational debate about the good and the bad, the advantageous and the disadvantageous, the just and the unjust, are the matrix out of which the human capacity for rational inquiry emerge for Aristotle. And this is why he holds in alternate formulations that man is a rational animal and a political animal. I mean, they're two sides of the same thing. The polis is a rational community that aims at noble life, and its laws, as Melissa notes, aimed at just that in a very direct attempt to form citizens in the virtues, in the Aristotelian system. For this reason, she parts company with Aristotle here and argues for a more limited view of government authority in Aquinas. And this brings me to my second point. The political common good may be much more closely bound up with the comprehensive common good for Aristotle, but less so for Aquinas, and rightly, even less so for us. Now, this has something to do with the change in the character of political institutions and practices that did not always get the attention that they deserve from political philosophers. But it also has something important to do with Christianity. One philosopher who saw this with striking clarity was none other than John Stuart Mill. Here's a passage from the first chapter of On Liberty. Quote, "The ancient commonwealths, though thought themselves entitled to practice, and the ancient philosophers countenanced the regulation of every part of private conduct by public authority, on the ground that the state had a deep interest in the whole bodily and mental discipline of every one of its citizens, a mode of thinking which may have seemed admissible in small republics, surrounded by powerful enemies, in constant peril of being subverted by foreign attack or internal commotion, and to which even a short interval of relaxed energy and self-command might easily be fatal. That they could not afford to wait for the salutary permanent effects of freedom. In the modern world, the greater size of political communities, and above all, the separation between spiritual and temporal authority, which place the direction of men's conscience in other hands than those which controlled their worldly affairs, prevented so great an interference by law in the details of private life." unquote. It is one thing for a small city, and most Greek poleis were about the size of this university, culturally homogeneous, united by religion and manifesting quite limited internal structural differentiation, to aim through its laws to inculcate virtue. And it's worth noting that Aristotle was actually under no illusion about how much virtue could be attained even here. It's quite another thing for a political community like, say, Germany, with 80,000 inhabitants, 137,000 square miles of territory, and a $5 trillion economy, much less in the United States or India. Size is not the only relative consideration here. The modern state, and for purposes of this, let's assume Max Weber's characterization of it as holding a monopoly on the use of coercive force in a defined territory and governed by rational legal authority in both its economic and political life through bureaucratic management of techniques and capacities that are only possible on the basis of modern science and technology. That modern state is a uniquely concentrated and powerful vehicle for the penetration and management of social life. It is capable of facilitating and implementing astonishing achievements, both good and bad. Only the modern state could have landed men on the moon. Only the modern state could have perpetrated the Holocaust. This way of speaking about the specifically political common good as an ensemble of conditions that facilitate the flourishing of individuals and groups is part of modern Catholic social doctrine. It's the formulation that's used in all the social teaching documents since the 1960s. It's a part of modern Catholic social doctrine's ambition to limit and discipline the modern state. Some of that limitation is just prudence in the face of the state's power, but an important part of it is also related to the character of Christianity itself, which at once lowers the stakes of terrestrial politics, gives birth to a new form of community, and raises the dignity of the individual human person through the articulation of a supernatural end, eternal life with the ultimate, separate, common good of the whole cosmos. Thank you.
I appreciate the panelists all sticking to the direction to keep their remarks short, so we'd have plenty of time for conversation, though the dean did, as deans typically do, go over a few minutes. It's a certain thing the class does. Melissa, would you like to respond very briefly, and then we'll open it up to conversation?
Sure, is this on?
It's on, yeah.
It's on, okay. So yeah, just very, very briefly. First, I mean, just again, thank you so much. Those were really thought-provoking remarks. And I largely agreed with everything that was said. I do think some of the concerns, Bill, that you raised are things where I think further dialogue can kind of clarify that I think largely we don't actually disagree on the points that you brought up. So the issue of, for instance, the emotions participating in reason. That's just something, I didn't have time to really get into, in just a kind of brief section of a chapter. I actually have a doctoral student from CUA who's writing on this issue of kind of further developing how virtues fit in with the new natural law account, and who's doing this kind of work and who really wants to integrate it more fully with a Thomistic theory of virtue. So I do think more work needs to be done on it, and I don't think that what I'm doing is the last word at all. It was simply meant to kind of get that conversation and project started. So I do think emotions participate in reason, and that the point of these kind of imaginative exercises that Grisey recommends, and other sorts of things like the moral principle of the golden rule, which asks you to put yourself in the place of the other person. The idea there is that it helps you to shape your emotions, right? Because the point is that we tend to be partial to ourselves and those to whom we have emotional attachments, and that can lead to unfairness in giving short shrift to things that we owe to more distant others. And the golden rule, by making you kind of put yourself in the place of the other, seriously imagine, well, how would I feel in that person's shoes? Really is a kind of training of emotions, such that over time, the idea is that your initial emotional response will be the correct one. So I do think that training of emotions and participation of emotions and reason does happen. And then this relates to the response to the second point, which is, on the worry about the separation of the different aspects of our nature. So, the four orders thing, it's a model. And like any model, and, moral theories for that matter are models, right? And so, like any model, it's going to have strengths and weaknesses. It's going to be better at capturing certain elements of reality, and it's going to have shortcomings in terms of capturing other elements of reality, because reality is much more complicated than any theoretical model that we can make of it. And so I think one of the potential shortcomings of the four orders model is that human nature encompasses all four of them. And so I think actually this is a slight revision since I wrote the book, right? Every time you publish something, it's almost like Murphy's Law that, a few months later you have a conversation with somebody who makes you realize, oh, maybe I should have said something slightly different on that point. So, this is an ongoing conversation, and I've actually come to think that the metaphysical understanding of human nature is something that transcends the four orders, because we are unified beings, and all of these things interrelate. So I think separating these things out can be helpful for some purposes, but for other purposes you have to recognize that we're a unified substance, and all of these aspects of our nature, they're all part of nature. It's not just that nature is a first order reality. Nature is all of these things. Our nature is all of these things altogether.
Okay. Bill, quick response, or Brad at all?
No, I mean, this is why a couple times in the talk I said we're kind of like siblings. I think these are razor-thin margins, so, but I still think there's something significant. So there was a debate in the 1200s between Bonaventure and Aquinas on this about whether virtues are really seated in the sensitive appetite. And the question is whether there can be really, everybody agrees that our unintegrated inclinations, that's a phrase used, right? That there's an endedness or a directionality, if you will, toward our emotions, our sensitive responses. Everybody agrees with that, you agree with that. But what happens when we do these imaginative exercises, which we all agree, Grisey agrees, we're trying to rein these things in. Is it a kind of external reining in, or is it a kind of a shaping of the things themselves? So, for instance, when you just answered, you said shape your emotions, which is the first time I've heard you say that. That would be more the Thomistic position, not that kind of emotions are reined in from the outside. But really what's underlying that is less of the imaginative techniques, which I'm sure practically we would all agree on. It's really a question about like the plurality of forms and the unity of the human person. So is our sensual nature continuous with and taken up by our rational nature? Or is there in some sense in which our rational nature is always a little bit kind of on the outside and reining things in? And by the way, more traditional Thomists have, I think, a little bit more faulty accounts that it seems to be in Grisey, maybe not, whereby it seems more they're being reined in from the outside. I think of like Giuseppe Butera and Nick Calm and people like that who basically think that good emotions sit down and shut up until reason tells them what to do, as opposed to really being kind of transformed so that, in a more spontaneous sense, the virtuous person is inclined toward the good. Now, to argue against my more spontaneous position, no one thinks that you should just do whatever you feel like, no matter how virtuous you are. So there is a balance here. So what we're trying to figure out is what that balance is. So that's what we're hammering out. So we're razor thin, I think, on that.
That's okay. Brad, can I ask you, maybe it's just a clarification for me, but I took you to be somewhat critical of what I take Melissa's position or the new natural law position that the political community is just an instrumental good, and you're pushing back a little bit, or Aristotle doesn't say that. But then at the end of your comments, you gave many good reasons on why today in the modern world we should think of the political community as an instrumental good. So is it just a different way of agreeing with Melissa? Is natural right changeable or natural law changeable given different conditions?
Aquinas says there's a sense in which it is. So the one way of putting it would be to say simply this: I don't think that the common good is instrumental. I do think that the state is instrumental. And that was the view of John Paul II, that was the view of Maritain, that was the view of Pius XII. So the state as a particular kind of framework is an instrumental good, but that's only part of the political common good.
Part of the political common good is beyond the state.
And the common good itself is an end, is a final cause, and the state is a means to that end.
Okay, good, that's helpful.
And I completely agree with that.
Okay. We have a tradition here of inviting our students to do the first question. I'm going to modify that. Students are anyone who will generate dispute among the panelists. Yeah. Santiago, stand up and tell us who you are. And do I need to repeat the question for the recording? I probably do. So brief so I can remember it. Yeah.
Yes, I'm Santiago.
Let me repeat the question. It was on the genesis of the term new natural law, which was in some ways a criticism of the position that the school of thought, which Melissa comes from, but has there been a reconciliation? Now let me add the division part to the question, because you've come over to the old natural law.
So there have been kind of discussions among proponents of the new natural law account of whether to keep the label or change it, and I think most of us have simply said, this is the label that people recognize, for better or for worse. And so, the typical move is to first introduce it using the word, saying so-called, and then putting a footnote saying we contest this, but everybody uses it, so we gotta have to keep using it so that people know what we're talking about, and then just continue. So, there is some truth in the new label, I think. If you just mean new to mean a contemporary development of Thomistic natural law theory, that started with the work of Germain Griset and then Joseph Boyle and John Finnis in the mid to late 20th century. So it's kind of new in that sense, new as development. And there are some disagreements explicit with Thomas, as well as some disagreements with kind of other versions of natural law theory in the family. But I don't think those versions are actually any less new. And, Finnis has argued, and I don't typically get into the exegetical historical debates, but Finnis has argued that some of the competitors that for instance, Edward Fazer, for instance, would be an example of this. He does want to say that you can directly derive moral conclusions from, say, facts about biology. So that's a genuine disagreement. Because new natural law theorists will say, well, yeah, these facts about biology are relevant. They could be one premise in a moral syllogism, but you can't do a moral syllogism and get a moral conclusion without at least one of the premises being a normative moral premise. So that's a genuine disagreement, but Finnis would argue that kind of move is actually not in Aquinas. That Aquinas doesn't go directly from non-moral premises to moral conclusions, and that's actually a kind of innovation of neo-scholastic interpretations, or misinterpretations of Aquinas that have been taken up by the so-called old natural law theorists. So if Finnis is right, the new natural law theorists are actually retrieving the original understanding of Aquinas, at least on this point about the relation between natural law and human nature, that has been distorted by neo-scholastic interpretations.
Can I follow up on this point? In your four orders, you say the first is physical, the order that reason can know but does not establish. And when you point to, you can't drive moral conclusions from physical facts of human nature. But what about moral facts of human nature, right? That we are a rational animal, right? Isn't that partly first order knowledge? And then to say the same thing or ask the same thing in a different way, Thomas, I think Aristotle too, says being and goodness are convertible terms. So you understand the goodness or excellence of a thing from understanding what it is. Does the new natural law agree with that metaphysical premise, being and goodness are convertible terms?
So I think it's complicated because being and goodness are also said analogically in many ways, right? And Thomas would also recognize that. And so because our nature is complex and has all of these dimensions, you have to think about which dimension of our being is primarily the thing that we are perfecting when we're talking about moral norms, right? So that's why I kind of bring out these examples of how, there are ways in which our perfection as animal organisms might not always be in line with what's required of us in our perfection as moral agents, and I think Thomas would certainly agree that ultimately our actions should be guided by our perfection as moral agents, which is more important than, although it doesn't discount, our perfection as organisms. So that's why this is all very complex, because our nature transcends all of these four orders and encompasses all of them. So they all relate. They're not kind of hermetically sealed off from one another. But what moral philosophy is primarily concerned with is that third order that reason introduces into the operations of the will.
Bill, you want to get in on this?
If it's all right. So here's my read of the answer to your question. So I'm not a new natural law pro. You tell me why this is wrong. I'm going to refer to you guys just to be provocative, okay? So it seems to me that you guys are rightly, strongly against two things. And one of them is biologism, which Pope John Paul II talks about, veritatis splendor, reading directly moral norms off biological nature. And it just seems to me you're completely right on that, okay? And then the other thing that new natural lawyers were holding the line on in the 70s and 80s that no one else was proportionalism, consequentialism, even in Catholic moral thought. And your development of a system, particularly of basic goods, and the way that the first principle of practical reasoning oriented toward these basic goods generates moral norms that are incommensurable and attains certain qualities that prevent you from being proportionalist, that's an achievement. What you were right to argue against, but now it's like you're backed into a box by the basic norms. And your scholarship, more than anyone I've seen, has tried to downplay the function of the incommensurability of the norms to make it simply just constitutive of flourishing. So activity is constitutive of flourishing. And you're but what would you lose by not talking about the basic norms? Why can't you just say that virtuous activity is constitutive of flourishing? You know what I mean? It seems to me that's the one thing that you're holding on to, or that the school of thought is holding on to, that had its place. We've defeated the two things that needed to be defeated. But now we're left with this residual that we have to keep backing off of. So the instrumentality of the common good is not a problem unless you articulate basic goods, because now you got to figure out how it's not one of them. But if you just say how the human good, which is a social good and a rational good, and then you articulate activity that's constitutive of flourishing, you don't have to deal with this problem. You guys can agree with each other and not have to back off the instrumentality thing. So how is that read wrong?
I mean, I'm not sure that we really disagree, except to say that I think it's true. The virtues are constitutive of flourishing. Virtuous activity is constitutive of flourishing. But it goes back to, that one of the purposes of a moral theory is to articulate what counts as a virtue, what counts as a virtuous activity. And, you can go with Aristotle and say, well, the virtuous activity is what the practically reasonable person would do. But that's not very helpful in terms of, for somebody who's not sure what the virtuous person would do, or who the correct exemplar is in this circumstance. And so you need a set of moral principles, and that's what the theory gives you. And the foundation of those principles is the first principles of practical reason directing us toward basic goods. Now, incommensurability, we can talk about that if people want to, is another kind of issue of dispute, and I think it's been misunderstood, and I try to explain in the book that it's been misunderstood because the idea that the basic goods are incommensurable is simply that, if I'm pursuing the good of friendship versus pursuing the good of knowledge, I'm really getting something distinctive. So, the fact that I'm here this morning, pursuing knowledge rather than, hanging out with a friend or calling my mom or something, well, I'm actually losing out on other things, other goods that I could be participating in. It's not that I'm getting all the goodness and more that I would have gotten, even though I think this is the morally right thing for me to be doing right now. But the answer to why it's morally right relates to what I talk about in the book as the vocation principle, which is a kind of principle for ordering and prioritizing goods in your life. And that principle, as well as the golden rule principle and similar principles, actually do commensurate at a kind of second level of reasoning. So they don't commensurate with respect to the basic value of the things that you're pursuing, because you still recognize that there are values that you're kind of leaving on the table when you prioritize one thing over another. And that's why it defeats consequentialism, because you can't just say, well, this is the greatest good that I'm pursuing right now. Because there are other goods, and there's no way to compare them. They're apples and oranges. So I still think we need to make those arguments, and that these principles are important for doing that and for guiding deliberation.
Okay, let's get as many questions as we can in the next 15 minutes. So short questions, very short answers. We'll go, tell us who you are,
My name is Richard Kim.
Go ahead, stand up,
Wait for the microphone, please. Oh, I can talk loudly enough.
That's live.
Okay. Okay. So, that conversation was really helpful. So I was wondering about the first order, which you call physical, and in some ways maybe you already answered this question. Okay. sorry. Okay, so it seemed like so that first order is what's connected to human nature. But when you read like the Aristotelians, like contemporary Aristotelians, when they talk about human nature, they talk about something like the human form. And they all say it's not the biological nature, although that's relevant in the way that you agree. It's a normative conception of nature. And so when you read the Aristotelians, they're always thinking of the way that nature determines like a teleological good and the proper activities and ends for that kind of thing. And so I was wondering if that first order isn't really what human nature is in this Aristotelian sense. And so maybe that's why you kind of started talking about like metaphysical conception. And now it seems like that's what the old natural law or the Aristotelians are all talking about in the first place, where nature and normativity are kind of entangled and bound together in a tight way.
Yeah, so I think, if I understood, I think that's, I at least partially agree, that the first order does not equal human nature. And then I think there's a common misconception that identifies first order and human nature.
This is his, why don't you walk around?
Whereas the new natural law view is that human nature encompasses all the orders. There's a different question, though, that's epistemological, which is how do we know the ends of our nature insofar as those ends are morally relevant? And I think that's where there is still going to be a disagreement with those who want to say, well, we know the ends of our nature by first having kind of purely theoretical, kind of metaphysical understanding of what our nature is, and then kind of deducing directly from that. I am a rational animal, I have cognitive powers, therefore knowledge is good. And I don't think the order, I don't think it works like that epistemologically in the order of knowledge. I think what happens in the order of knowledge is more complicated. That, as children, for instance, we have experiences of being curious, satisfying curiosity, learning things, attaining true knowledge, right, going from ignorance to truth. And then as you reach the age of reason, you have first a theoretical insight, this experience of having curiosity satisfied, learning something true about the world is knowledge, right? And so you have a theoretical insight both that knowledge is possible and of what knowledge is, right, as a kind of conceptual reality at a basic level. And then following almost immediately, I think, from that, you get an underived practical insight that this thing that I now understand to be knowledge is good, is worthy of pursuit for its own sake. And then, by reflection, you can recognize, oh, well, so knowledge must then be the perfection of my cognitive powers, or one of the perfections of my cognitive powers. So there's a kind of going back and forth from the theoretical or metaphysical to the practical, and then back again. So they're intermingled, but epistemologically, it's because of the practical insight that knowledge is good that I then know that it's the end of my cognitive powers, not the other way around.
Okay, there's a lot in that, but let's, okay, sir, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm Grady Stuckman. I'm a graduate student at Bowling Green State University studying political philosophy, and my question is about how can limited government promote the common good, and it seems that a lot of the new natural law theorists seem to present it in a way that's not much different than classical liberalism, and I don't know if that's a problem for review, but is it exactly identical to classical liberalism, the promotion of the common good and limited government, and is that a problem for your view?
So I think there are some significant differences with classical liberalism in the rationale for limited government. So the standard, of course, there are multiple versions of liberalism, just like there are multiple versions of natural law, but the kind of standard classical liberal idea is that government should at least attempt to be neutral about the good, and that the coercive use of government power should not kind of take into account or shouldn't be aimed at a kind of comprehensive understanding of human flourishing overall. And I think that kind of neutrality is both impossible and undesirable. So I do think that government needs to legislate with the view toward the human good, and that there needs to be political debates about what the content of that human good is. But where it overlaps with liberalism is recognizing that if you understand that our flourishing is largely something that we achieve through our own activity, through the exercise of our agency, right? Nobody can make me virtuous for me. And part of that development of virtue is also fulfilling the responsibilities that I have, the responsibilities to the various communities that I'm a part of. And that includes responsibilities of the self-governance of those communities, the governance of the family, the governance of intermediate associations of which I form a part. And so to the extent that government attempts to micromanage those subsidiary communities, it's actually undermining the capacity for me to do what I need to do in order to flourish. So there's an argument for limited government and for the kind of civil liberties typically associated with liberalism, but the argument is based on perfectionist grounds, on the understanding that human flourishing requires the active exercise of our own agency, not a kind of passive, allowing government to micromanage your life.
Okay. Sir, yes, please. Wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you very much for this. This is very helpful. My question is about incommensurability. So to take an example from your book, you say that compare play. I think it's the example is play versus religion, and it's a mystery novel, right? Where you have to choose in particular points about whether you're reading a mystery novel or you're engaging in religion with God, for example. And I guess one of my questions about the incommensurability, there's two questions about the basicness of the goods. One is that it seems like on at least a lot of traditional Christian models that these aren't really incommensurable in the sense that, for example, there's a friar asked St. Francis what he would do if the world was about to end, and St. Francis said, "That's going to be in my garden because that's what I'm supposed to be doing." And it's a much longer story. But the idea being that how you commune and you engage in harmony with God is not necessarily dependent on the specific thing you're doing, but there's different ways. Like if you're playing tennis, for example, that's another way of engaging in harmony with God, or what have you. So that's one question: is to what extent these really are incommensurable, and there's not the original hierarchy that I think you're in some ways trying to push back against. And then the other is a question about incommensurability. Then is what happens with, for example, heaven, right? Because there you don't have the basic good of marriage. You might have other basic goods. I don't have a whole huge knowledge of heavenology, but very quickly. But you do seem to be giving up one basic good. But the idea is that there's perfection in heaven, and you're not losing anything. So how does incommensurability work with these sorts of cases? Thank you so much.
So we could talk for a long time about that, and I'm happy to chat further. But I'll be brief right now because we want to get in more questions. So I'll just say, religion has a kind of double status. So there's the status of religion as a basic good, in which case it is incommensurable in the sense that, if I go to Mass, I'm not working out or hanging out with a friend, and so there are other goods being left on the table that would perfect me or fulfill me in distinct ways, right? Now, you pointed out something interesting, which is, but you can serve God by reading the mystery novel if you think that's what God is calling you to do at that point, or by hanging out with your friend if you think that's what God is calling you to do at that point. And that's kind of looking at religion from this kind of second level of moral guidelines, not the level of basic goods. And I do think, and I argue in the book, that at that level you can recognize a principle that I call the unity of life principle, that you need a kind of overarching principle that enables you to coherently order all of your pursuits and all of maybe the various facets of your vocation and other elements of life. And I think the only thing that can do that is actually the good of religion, that you can recognize because of its transcendent status, and because religion is the kind of thing that you can pursue while pursuing everything else, without failing to recognize the distinctive value of the other things that you're pursuing, because you can see, if I think God is calling me to do this in that moment, I can do this and be serving God at the same time. So religion has this capacity to serve this kind of architectonic overarching unifying role that orders and governs everything else that you do in your life without kind of flattening the differences among different goods and the different roles that they play in your flourishing. On the heaven question, I do think I think of heaven as in line with kind of Gaudium et Spes 39, that as the kingdom of God where all genuine earthly goods are kind of taken up, perfected, fulfilled. And so all the dimensions of our being, I think, are fulfilled in some way. It's a mysterious way that we don't fully understand. In heaven, and I think that actually includes the dimension of our being that is perfected by marriage, though obviously it's done differently. And that's because on earth, the way that marriage works is because it's tied to reproduction, it requires this exclusivity and so on. But the idea of the kind of comprehensive union of persons is actually the idea that in the eschaton we're supposed to share with everybody through union with Christ. And so that this aspect of our good is fulfilled in a new, more spiritual way in heaven. So I do think that at least there are analogs of all the basic goods in heaven.
Okay, let's try to get one or two more. George.
Hello, George Muirhead. I just want a quick clarification. From what I understood, from what you said doing what you think God is calling or supposing you to do is a second order good. I always thought of the will of God and, behold, Father, I've come to do thy will as the most preeminent basic good. I would just like you to expand on that, please.
Right, so it's hard to give this as a short answer because it almost requires kind of backing up and saying more about the whole structure of the new natural law theory than I have time to do. But the idea is that you can think about the different basic goods simply as distinct benefits that perfect you as a human person in different ways, right? And so that's the sense in which they're incommensurable. That when I'm praying or going to Mass, I'm benefiting myself, I'm flourishing in a distinct way than if I'm, studying philosophy, right? And so that's the sense in which they're incommensurable. But then the whole point of the moral norms of natural law is to actually give you guidance for choosing among all the competing goods that you could be pursuing at any moment, and for choosing among all the different people whom you could be seeking to benefit at any moment. And so it's kind of looking at it from this kind of second tier level of moral guidelines that you can then recognize this architectonic status of pursuing the will of God, pursuing harmony with God and the promotion of human fulfillment in cooperation with God and with God's particular will for you. That does serve as this overarching good. So I think we're in agreement on that.
Okay, maybe we get one more here. Or short, maybe two, yeah.
Thank you. I would like to talk to the last point that you made before that one on the nature of unity of life and religion as essential to that. Religion certainly is one of Finnis's 8 basic goods, but I would like to ask not just from a new natural law, but a classical natural law perspective on what role, especially in contemporary society, the state has in promoting or engaging religion as a good, while we certainly don't want to, or I don't know, maybe we do want to go the way of Costa Rica and Liechtenstein, have a confessional state, maybe if that's what you're feeling. But I would like to have some perspective on what promotion or engagement of this good would look like from both perspectives.
I don't think that's a short question.
I could try to answer it briefly. So, I have a paper on this about religion as a basic human good and its implications for church-state issues, basically arguing against some contemporary theorists in legal and political philosophy who basically say, well, religion is just one more thing that people care about, and so it ought not to receive any privileged position in law. So, for instance, we shouldn't give any greater consideration legally to people's, religious convictions than we do to any preference that they might have, or any conscientious conviction that they might have, even if it's not religious. And I argue there that because of the uniquely kind of architectonic role of the good of religion, and because even through natural reason, we can recognize religion to be an important distinctive element of our flourishing, that there are reasons for the state to recognize the importance of religion without doing so in a confessional way. And then you get into, thorny debates about, well, what counts as a religion and so on, and we can talk about that. But I think, if you define it correctly and fairly broadly, that there are reasons for the state to privilege religion, but that then you actually endanger religion, and this is partially a prudential concern. You're likely to endanger religion rather than help it if you use coercive means to push people into particular religious beliefs or religious practices, because that's actually likely to undermine the freedom that's necessary for genuine religious belief and religious practice.
All right, before we thank our panelists, two invitations. In this room at 10:45, when our next panel begins, let me invite you to what should be a very, very good panel, also sponsored by the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government, Martin Luther King Jr., Barry Goldwater, and the Living Tradition of American Freedom. We have Nick Bucola, very distinguished professor from Claremont McKenna College, and Melvin Rogers, I believe an endowed chair from Brown University. Please join us for that at 10:45. And then at 12:30, over at the law school, our annual Rice-Hassan lecture will be given by Judge William Pryor, very distinguished jurist on the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. And if you can elbow out some law students and graduate students, you might even get a free lunch over there. That's at 12:30. What room, Rick? First floor, right across the street. Bill Madison, Bradley Lewis, Melissa Moschella, thank you very much.